Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I am joined today by a special guest kicking off our Season 11. Esther Armah is with us, and she's an international award-winning journalist, playwright, and speaker and author. She's CEO at the Armah Institute of Emotional Justice, which she has also written a book about, and she's had the chance to work globally on this work. Her book, Emotional Justice, is a roadmap for racial healing and was a #1 new release on Amazon in the category of general sociology of race relations. And she's really excited to share the message today with us about how her work is inspiring others, kind of lighting that spark for others in racial equity work, and how to use emotions for justice. So excited to have her with us. She's had an opportunity to earn the Community Healer Award, Most Valuable New York Radio Host, and also had the opportunity to be named one of Africa's Women Leaders as well. So thanks, Esther, for making the time today. So excited to have you.
Thank you, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to join you. Happy New Year. Happy New Year to all of the folks listening, watching, etc.
Yeah. Well, start us off with, your work now spans all sorts of, all places in the world. Your message is really resonating, so much around this conversation of racial equity. How do we use emotions for justice? So excited to hear, what's the backstory? How did you get into this work? What are you hearing nowadays? And just share your message with our listeners.
So I was born in London, went to school there and started my work there, lived there for about 10 years. And then I moved to New York, where I lived for almost another 10 years before I moved to Accra in Ghana, where I've been living for about 5 or 6 years. So 3 cities, 3 countries, 3 continents. And I say that because I self-identify as a global Black chick. Easy peasy and unforgettable, I hope. But I also say that because that contributes to how emotional justice even came to be. I was a journalist. I was on assignment. My family is from Ghana, is Ghanaian. And my dad was an activist who worked in pre-independence Ghana and then went on to become a diplomat and a minister. And so he was telling a long, regular story that I'd heard a billion times about the coup in Ghana, which happened in February 1966. I knew it as a date in Ghana's history that was about a president, policy, a military coup, and the end of an era of history. What I had never heard it as was a story that actually centered my mother and my elder sisters. And my mother essentially broke an almost 20-year silence and explained and told the story that actually it was not my dad who was in the house when the night the tanks came, rolled up to our front door, smashed in the door, soldiers in battle fatigues and guns broke in, smashed everything. The entire night sky of Accra was just lit up with the process of a military coup. And the person that the soldiers met was my mother. They put a gun to her head. It was a crazy night. It was a terrifying night. It was a devastating night. And what I learned the day my mother broke her silence is that history is more than dates and information. They are stories of what happens to people. And those are people that may be related to you, that are part of your community, your family. But also more than that, it's about more than what is told. It's about what is not told and who is not in the telling of how we think about what we call history. So that really was the beginning of me thinking specifically about my own personal story, my family, and how a moment in history that got us kicked out of the country, kicked out of the house, exiled, and living in London shaped and transformed the trajectory of my young girlhood into my young adulthood, but also made me think specifically about whose voices do we not hear whose lenses do we not listen to? And what do we lose because we haven't heard them and we don't listen to them? And I think my mother breaking her silence became a connection about how we think about history and whose stories are told or not told. It comes all the way up to equity. Whose voices do we privilege and whose voices do we not privilege? But for me, it was also about saying, I'm a professional chick, I'm educated, I'm out in the world, I'm doing my thing, but I was dealing with a lot of emotional trauma and emotional damage that I did not understand. And when my mother broke her silence, dots were connected. And because those dots were connected, I went from looking at the personal impact to thinking about it within my community, within my country, and then living globally as I did, looking at these global cities and spaces and communities and countries, and asking the question, how does the emotional world drive what we think of as policy? From Ghana, I went to South Africa, from Ghana, I went to Philadelphia, then to South Africa, then to London. Those assignments, those journeys then became the building blocks for what would become emotional justice. So that's really how it kind of came to be.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Simple story, right? Yeah. Wow. I mean,
Yeah.
wow. I can only imagine when your mother broke her silence about her story, how freeing, but also revisiting that trauma for both of you, how that could feel. I can only imagine. So thank you so much for sharing that story. I appreciate what you said, Esther, about whose voices do we hear? Whose voices do we privilege? Whose story doesn't get to be told, at least not in actual, words. It's passed down, much like a part of your story. I wonder, in the work you do now with emotional justice, having spent time on different continents, how important, or how has being in vastly different places, like you said, from London to Africa to Philadelphia, etc., how have those global experiences affected your voice?
The biggest thing it has taught me is the importance of honoring the specificity of location. And that mattered because it meant that when I created a racial healing roadmap, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It wasn't about universality. It was about specificity. And particularly being in South Africa and getting to do amazing interviews with people like Desmond Tutu, being in Philadelphia, meeting, Winnie Mandela, meeting these amazing folks from the anti-apartheid movement who were building the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is lauded and applauded all over the world. But it was a racial healing roadmap that was about South Africa and the specific scenario that South Africa found itself in at that time. So it was very specifically about Black and white people with a very specific privileging of whiteness. But it then became the roadmap and the framework that was applauded all over the world. So the challenge with that is everywhere isn't South Africa. So then what does it mean when you take a roadmap that was rooted in that particular turmoil that centered whiteness and put that in America? You continue a role of centering whiteness and what you define as racial healing. And so what I found is that that's what kept happening in different spaces. And I could see it in how we thought about racial healing in America and notions of the forgiveness of white supremacist violence. I saw it in Kenya. I saw it in London. I would keep seeing that, the idea of privileging whiteness when we thought about healing, the idea of thinking about and centering white anxiety when we think about healing. And that the challenge with doing that is it means that there's only one group doing the emotional work and one group is on the receiving end of that emotional work. And you can't get to healing if one person is doing the work and one person is on the receiving end of that work, because part of healing is about connection and understanding. But how do you understand when you've not made the emotion, you've not done the emotional labor to really recognize your own contribution and how the world comes to be? And so the beauty of being in different places and seeing and having all these different experiences was how important people's specificity is to them. And so for me, it was two things: honor the specificity, look at the human connection. And it is that combination, the power of specificity and the importance of human connection, that would really shape how I built the framework, and shapes how we run the institute, shapes how we do the trainings, the whole 9 yards. And it's a real, it's a sobering thing to hear how specific people are about their lens. And for me, I always hear connection, because I have the benefit of someone's lens, someone else's lens to think about. And the sad reality at the time was that what was being centered was whiteness. What was being centered was white economic anxiety. What was being centered was white emotional security. And that centering has a price to pay. And the price to pay manifests in what we call diversity, equity, inclusion today, that too often does the same thing. And it costs us, because you cannot create equity if you keep privileging one group of people.
And it's often subtle, like you said, the centering of the narrative, the centering of the feelings. It doesn't feel, I mean, sometimes it feels very overt. And obviously the situation you're talking about, South Africa, we have a member of our team that lived in South Africa for a very long time. So just understanding that whole story, I mean, that wasn't that long ago that happened. But as you transcend that blueprint, it's going to live differently in different places, like you said, too. I'm curious, Esther, the two themes that you mentioned, specificity and connection, how do those come together in the roadmap, in the tools that you provide? Help us understand emotional justice, and what does that roadmap look like?
Emotional justice is a roadmap for racial healing. And it really is about how do we grapple with a legacy of untreated trauma from the oppressive systems that have shaped our world and shaped us, right? Shaped how we see ourselves and how we see each other. And how does the way we see ourselves and each other, how does that impact how we move through the world, and how we sustain systems that, even if we know intellectually are oppressive and problematic, we contribute to sustaining them because of how we've been shaped by them. So emotional justice is saying we need to name the emotions that drive how these systems are sustained. We need to name our contribution to how those oppressive systems are sustained. And that we need to recognize that as much as we advocate for the dismantling of harmful structures, that we are the dismantlers that we have been waiting for. But in order for us to understand what that looks like, we have to first name and understand how the emotional world drives and sustains these systems. Emotional justice is a roadmap that's all about identifying that, explaining that, breaking it down in practical and creative ways, and then coming up with ways to do that dismantling that can actually work in a specific way. So for one example, I use language specifically. I'm a storyteller, I'm a journalist, I'm a playwright. Storytelling is a massive way of how we understand each other. And so languages too, and naming things is a really important part of kind of getting to the heart of it. So with emotional justice, we talk about unlearning what I call the language of whiteness. And the language of whiteness is the narrative that everybody's been taught, Black, brown, white, indigenous, about how the world came to be and our role in it as Black, brown, white, and indigenous people. And so we've all been taught essentially that whiteness is the world, whiteness built the world, whiteness saves the world, at the center of things is whiteness. And so when I say whiteness, I don't mean white people, I mean this narrative that identifies your role as a Black, brown, and indigenous person, and where white people live in that space. And because of that teaching, that nurturing, that enforcement, we all have an idea of ourselves and each other, and we move accordingly. Part of what emotional justice is saying is that you have to understand how that shows up in your emotional world, because we can get, and often do get, educationally, intellectually, yes, discrimination is bad. Yes, exclusionary action is bad. Yes, we want equity. But the intellectual understanding is not the same as what I call the emotional connection to power that centers whiteness. And emotional justice is all about your emotional relationship to power and how, because it centers whiteness, it interrupts the work of actually creating equity. But in order to dismantle that and unlearn that, we have to identify the ways that that shows up, right? What does that look like? What does it feel like? How does it manifest? What behaviors do we see? And the work of emotional justice is naming that. And so one of the, there are four languages of whiteness. And so one of them is called emotional patriarchy. And emotional patriarchy is a society that caters to privileges and centers the feelings of white men, no matter the cost and consequence to all women and to Black, brown, and indigenous people. And we know workplaces that run according to the feelings of a white man in power. And the result of that creates an entire organizational culture. But because we don't and haven't named that, we can't then unlearn it and transform it. So that's just one example.
Yeah, language is so important in calling attention to non-inclusive language. I mean, words that are so commonplace, unfortunately, like the use of the word master, for example, and how white is usually code for good and black list, things like that are usually code for negative, and just how we center whiteness in these everyday, subtle, but even overt, as you think about it, ways. I'm curious, Esther, you said there were four. Would you mind sharing an overview of the four?
Sure. So there's four. So emotional patriarchy, which is the catering and centering of white men's feelings, no matter the cost of consequence to all women and to Black, brown, and indigenous people. Racialized emotionality. That's where we take universal emotions, anger, vulnerability, fear, and then we racialize what is universal. So we add color and race into what is a universal emotion. And then once we've racialized that, that person then becomes targeted for violence. So what does that look like? So you take anger. Anger is a human emotion. You can get angry for a circumstance, a thing, something has happened and you get angry or upset. But you add anger to Blackness and to a person, then you have an angry Black woman or you have an angry Black man. And whether you're in London, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in America, whether you're here on the continent, that term, angry Black woman, is not a woman who happens to be Black and feels angry. Angry Black woman is a term that is about disqualification, that you're problematic, that you can't be trusted, that you're unprofessional. It's to be avoided at all costs. But if you think about what's actually happening, it means you're denying the very human emotion of anger to an entire group of people because they faced cost and consequence for their anger in ways that other people did not, and certainly in a way that a white man does not. So that's the second one. Third one is emotional currency. Emotional currency is a world where women, and especially Black women, are treated like currency, like an economy, where their value appreciates or depreciates according to their service to whiteness, essentially white men, all men, white people, but service outside of themselves. And when your being, your body, your breath, your life is treated as currency that only has value in relationship to people and things outside of you, it creates a relationship to yourself that is solely about productivity. And we know, particularly with America's history, there's a long, long history of seeing Black women, Black bodies, Black men as labor to be utilized as opposed to human beings to be valued. So that's emotional currency. And then the fourth one is emotional economy. And that is a world where the emotions of white men create and drive what becomes policy, is relentlessly, those emotions are driven to create policy. And because there's a centering of them, the rest of us, all women, and then Black, brown, and indigenous people have to live with the consequences. So an example of that is when the language of whiteness creates this emotional patriarchy, a centering of white men's feelings. And the language of whiteness, as I call it, creates this idea of, particularly of the masculinity and a white alpha masculinity of, conquer or die. That's the approach to power. Then its relationship to power is about dominion. It's about subjugation. It's about exploitation. Well, then the challenge with that is, for white men, you understand yourself in relationship to having dominion over somebody else. How does that manifest? Roe v. Wade being overturned. How does that manifest? Wanting to dictate how people's bodies move through space. And without that dictation, somehow you're less of a man. The connection of your masculinity and your humanity to somebody else's subjugation and exploitation. And so those four: emotional patriarchy, racialized emotionality, emotional currency, and emotional economy. It's unlearning each of those and then replacing them with what I call the love languages of emotional justice. And there are four of those: intimate reckoning, intimate revolution, resistance negotiation, and revolutionary Black grace. And each of them has a specific definition. Intimate reckoning is about the emotional work that white people, specifically white women, are required to do in order to contribute to the dismantling of structures that are harmful. Intimate revolution is about Black women centering replenishment and rest, and redefining a relationship to labor and value that centers a productivity that's about depletion and exhaustion and debilitation. Resistance negotiation, which is really about a response to what Dr. Robin DiAngelo called white fragility. How do white people work through their white fragility? Resistance negotiation. That they've got to negotiate with the resistance to sitting in hard conversations when there is challenges around race, because there is no arrival at anything that is equitable without hard conversations about things that have been so challenging for entire groups of people for 500 plus years. And then revolutionary Black grace is a specific love language about and for global Black people, which is about unlearning American Blackness as criminal and African Blackness as wretched. So what you see with what has to be unlearned and what it has to be replaced with, these four love languages of emotional justice, the specificity that I talked about in the first explanation, that there are things for white women to do and white men to do. There are things for Black and brown and indigenous folks to do, but the work is not the same, but we all have emotional labor to do. And that's really the premise of the entire roadmap. It's what I break down in the book, and it's what we implement through the Institute.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for so many people, it feels like a choice to engage in this emotional labor. And for many white people, I should say, and even how unsettling you talked about that discomfort of just saying, labeling whiteness. And even, I've noticed people grimace when I say white man, white woman, just as we much would do with somebody of a different ethnicity or race. But this idea that whiteness is just the standard and we only call out differences with the other, it's really unsettling. At the same time, so much of our language, like you said, centers that story, centers that perspective, and others, the other perspective. I'm wondering,
Absolutely.
Esther, like for folks that are like this, yes, emotional injustice is needed. These concepts, I can apply and look out for. I wonder, is there something tangible, like an action step? I always dislike simplifying complex messages, but I'm wondering if there was something people could do aside from pick up your book, Emotional Justice, of course, but what else might you recommend to folks that want to engage in these conversations and may just feeling that resistance like you talked about?
So one, I would definitely say, buy the book to be able to get the detail of breakdown, right, to really help you. But the second thing is to ask yourself the question, who can I listen to today that I have never listened to before? Whose voice can I engage that I have never engaged before? And how might listening to that voice, that perspective, that person then shape whatever I think I know about this thing that we call equity, diversity, race, blackness, whiteness.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, who is somebody I'm not talking to? Who's someone I haven't talked with much about this? What perspective am I missing? Do I not fully understand without putting that burden of education on others? That's why books like yours are so helpful to give people something to start with, a question to raise. Hey, I read about this concept and here's something I'm wrestling with. I think it's always nice to have those kind of icebreakers, because sometimes it's hard to just bring up, these bigger concepts. Although the more you do it, the easier that gets too.
Right. And one of the things I would just say is that one of the things I'm really passionate about saying in the book is how easy actually it is to bring these things up within the circles of which you naturally move, but people don't, and they don't because that's part of how you sustain notions of whiteness. That you choose the conversations that you stay away from, and everybody is careful and thoughtful in what they stay away from. And emotional justice is inviting you to say, what might you bring to the tables that you consistently sit at that you haven't brought to before? I don't agree that it's hard. I think that it's unfamiliar, and I think that there is such a commitment to the comfort of whiteness that we make the idea of discomfort this massive, huge deal. And the truth is, discomfort is just part of life. And we have spent far too long and spent far too many words articulating the discomfort of whiteness. And I would argue pandering to that discomfort. Yeah. There is no growth in any part, in any field, in any world, in anything that anybody does that doesn't come with discomfort. It's part of what's required to learn. Yep. So part of what emotional justice is naming is saying, we don't need to spend so much time in spaces and conversations where people are aware. I always, when people say, people aren't aware, I always disagree. I say I disagree, and they say, why do you disagree? I said, because you know what conversations to stay away from, and you're careful about staying away. And that is a choice. So you can just make a different choice. Yeah, it's not
you're purposely tuning it out. Like it's everywhere, right? That's
Absolutely.
A choice. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So thought-provoking. Yeah, and it isn't hard. It's a conditioning that happens on the white side. As a white person, and this is not me defending it at all, please don't take it that way, but it's more, we get conditioned to not talk about these things. Like, shh, don't talk about that. Or, oh, I don't see color. These harmful messages that are everywhere in our culture too about whiteness doesn't behoove white people to pretend.
But it's also,
like these are issues.
Right. But it's also not true. When people say I don't see color, it's just not true. When they say, like those things are just not true. And so, and I think also the other part of it is the importance of urgency. The real cancer of DEI has been this idea that we have time to move at people's comfortable levels. Let's let people get comfortable. And I always say people are dying. You don't have time to get comfortable. This is first responder realities that we're dealing with. Mm-hmm. So we've got to come to them like first responders. There needs to be a much greater sense of emergency. And the challenge of the history that is still our present is the emotional labor that white people are used to on their behalf by Black people, and the unspoken but very real resentment that is felt about the mere idea that they would do and be required to do emotional labor that's connected to equity. And that's part of what the book talks about, is that's part of what you're wrestling with resistance negotiation, is the resentment that you should even do that work on the one hand. And then the other is that the expectation that you should be incentivized, and the people that should incentivize you are essentially Black, brown, and indigenous people. Like, when that is so much part of the work, it is so offensive and traumatizing and devastating, because in the end, the question is very simple. What do you believe about the world that you want to create? Mm-hmm. And what is the work that you're willing to do to create it? And the incentivization for you to bring not your humanity, but your emotionality, your honesty to the table is just the beginning of the process. And, we're good and grown and smart. It really is not as challenging as we keep saying that it is. It's a way to excuse ourselves from tables of accountability. And we're beyond time of simply saying, you don't get to leave at this point. Nobody gets to leave. Humanity, nobody gets to leave. It's a humanity table. None of us get to leave.
Yep. I'm with you on the sense of urgency. It's like, just hurry and wait and hurry and wait. It's so harmful, especially to think of how many people are being subjected to real emotional pain. And like you said, how many lives we're losing because of this challenge. Is more of a sense of urgency. And I love what you said earlier too, about we can be the dismantlers we're waiting for, like stop waiting for someone else to do this work. There is room at the table, as you say, for all of us to join in this work and have that sense of urgency. Esther, in wrapping up today, I'd love for you to share with our listeners, what's the easiest way they can get a copy of your book, follow your work, or can they connect with you?
So we would love, they can check out the website, theaiej.com, www.theaiej.com. Become a subscriber, get our monthly newsletter. We want to welcome you to the emotional justice global community. The books are available right at this point all over the world. Of course, Amazon is one of the easiest, but support your independent bookstore and go check it out there as well as the regular Barnes and Nobles and all the regular spots that you can go to. We have an event coming up. We have events kind of every other month. So when you sign up for the newsletter, you get information for events that are really designed to introduce you to emotional justice.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, consider hiring Julie and the Next Pivot Point team to come speak at your organization's next event. We speak on a range of topics from active allyship to inclusive leadership to how to create a culture where everyone feels seen, heard, and feels a sense of belonging. Thank you for being on this journey with us. Go to nextpivotpoint.com to learn more.